then you want to move on to sound design?
Yep.
So what sounds are you particularly interested in making?
I guess like dubsteppy sounds, like non-yoi dubsteppy sounds on loop.
I usually use filter and synth to make like saw wave, and then I usually put preamp after that. That would be my waveform. And then one sound I use a lot is like the growl. Like that, for example. It's really simple. You just put a low pass filter on it with very high depth, like 96 to 100-ish. Rate can be whatever you want, right? And cut off at 0 so that it literally goes throughout the whole spectrum. And then I distort it. Usually fuzz works really well, or like preamp core metal if you want. I mean, a lot of it is really managing the distortion well. I personally don't like basses that are too resonant. I like to have it like fat, like, you know, fuller, but not like too resonant on like one frequency. And then after that, I use phaser usually to sequence it. So I have that. I would usually put the manual to like 0 to 10-ish. But then one cool thing is if you put the manual up, then, you know, it changes the note. I think the hard part is not necessarily making the sounds, in my opinion, because most really cool sounds are just, you know, really distorting things creatively. Sometimes you can stack sounds together. Maybe you can put an oscilloscope on top of it and then distort it. I highly recommend getting Serum, for example. A lot of sounds are just stacking oscillators. Like you can see here, like there's a saw wave. Maybe you can put a sub under it, and then like if you distort it together, it can create some cool harmonics. Or like Supernova, for example. I think that's what it's called, like the Skrillex track. It's basically like very low saw wave with like noise on top, and then you distort it and you get like a pretty similar sound already. It's about stacking waveforms, basically. Something very common that in EDM is FM. It gives you that metallic texture, and that's a lot of times if you search up Serum tutorials. So that's what I did. I tried to like use Serum sounds, but then yeah, I usually just end up putting delays after my sound to get that metallic feel.
I tend to be relying on similar sounds quite a lot. Like when I for example want to make a melody, what would you recommend doing in those scenarios? Do you like, would you say like rely on your past knowledge, or would you say like try experimenting and find something brand new if you have like a sound you want to make?
I think it's always nice experimenting. A lot of really cool sounds come from just, you know, the more you fuck around, the more you find out. What I do with my SY, I really end up relying on the presets I had that I know work, but they sound completely different after because I apply new knowledge in and I try switching things around and I experiment. And with the SY, there's a lot more you can do. Like some common ideas that help would be like what I just said, stacking sounds together. Like maybe just two cool sounds you have already, you can stack them together and it would be something completely different. Using different input sounds, a grand delay is bound to sound like a grand delay. Osbot's gonna sound, you know, it's harder to make that sound original than to just use different techniques. It's all about understanding as well. If you understand how certain effects work better, then you can control it more. It really depends on what sound you're trying to make.
So a specific sound I had in mind, like ARPs. Like I've made ARPs using Osbot, like preamp, tremolo, reverb, and another one using like granular delay and just transpose. But I was wondering if there's any other like cool ways, you know, to make ARPs on the MK2.
Do you use pattern slicer normally, or do you just...
I've only used pattern slicer for hi-hats.
Okay, you know the jingle bells thing I made? Like that's with high pass synth and then pattern slicer with a super high rate. And then I EQ'd it a bunch, like flangers, whatnot. Became that. About ARPs, like let's say there's this pluck. I say try to get the volume automation or like the pluckiness of it first. Depends on what type of ARP you want again, but pattern slicer is a way to make it go saw down, more percussive, if that's what you want. One thing you can also do is like use halftime. That usually creates some cool textures and cool sounds that are pretty loop and one device exclusive in a way. And honestly, I think, you know, just to be quirky, I would just use my voice sometimes, or like that for robot, and then parent slicer, and then you can put transpose on it, right? maybe distort it a little bit. I have no idea how that's going to sound. Like something like that, right? I know that does not sound like an ARP, but I think like that's where like cooler ideas come from. I would try to use one shots. One cool thing you can do also is you can do a saw up and then reverse it. Like if we have this sound, do you know the filter technique I did for peaky peaky peak? The pluck sound, the bass pluck sound.
Is it LPF synth and then like probably using like transpose?
So it's LPF, synth, distortion, and then another LPF. And the last LPF would go like 0 to 100 and then back to 0, right? Something like that. Cutoff wise, my rate is a quarter note, but the track is at an eighth note. So it would just record the saw up part. And once I reverse it, it becomes that. So I think you can do something similar with an ARP sound. But then instead of filter, maybe you can use tremolo. That's what I was trying to do with the robot thing. Or you can try pattern slicer. And then I have transpose on track effects. And then I play it on the launchpad. Honestly, the most cost efficient way is still to just osvocoder it. Because with osvocoder, you also have attack and release. So I say also experiment with the input you're putting before osbot. Not just what you're inputting in the mic, but also maybe like an effect before it can change a lot. Because osbot tends to be like pretty mid heavy. If you want something higher that sounds more like a synth, then maybe you want to change that.
Just was curious why people use pattern slicer and not step slicer.
Because pattern slicer gives you that saw down, like it can really go, it can be very percussive that step slicer simply just can't do. The SY like volume sequencer, like the saw down on that is like, it sounds really, really good. Like it sounds like an actual synth because, well, it's technically a synth. But the pattern slicer doesn't really sound like that. With step slicer, there's more you can do though, especially with the step length. One thing you can try to do to make everything sound more human is to sequence the step length to kind of emulate velocity, how hard you're playing it. And I've done that with drum sequencing and it actually works. Like, it sounds pretty good. There are the two kicks that I panned as well. I normally don't do that. I cut out the subs, so it's fine. And that's with the level on the step slicer and length maybe even. So yeah, depends on how you use it, what you want to do.
I see. So the pattern slicer gives the saw down. So like step slicer will be like this, and pattern would be like this,
yeah, like that
kind of thing.
And there's duty and attack. Like there's no attack knob on the step slicer.
I was wondering the whole time why people use pattern a lot, especially for like bass lines. So I was just wondering what the merit was over other effects like tremolo and step slicer.
I would normally use phaser, flanger, stuff like that, because you also get more out of the effect usually. Depends on what you want, obviously, out of it. With pattern slicer, you can't control the actual sequence.
For like house tracks, that's like the bass flux as their bass lines. Was wondering what's good effect combination to create that. Like my guess would be like to use LPFs. I
say the peaky peak technique would work very well. Because I've been wanting to make some like deep house myself as well. Like I think something like that with like deeper tone, maybe like not as fast. Definitely a sawdown filter. I've made that sound like many times on a synth, and on a synth it's really easy to make. I really recommend getting like a synth like this. Serum you have to pay for, but like if you get Vital, that's for free. So what I would do is like the envelope controls the volume, basically. So this is what the tremolo is supposed to do. I really suggest like learning what all this is about. Attack is like how fast it goes until the top of the volume, right? Yeah, ADSR. Decay would be this. Sustain is how long it sustains for. Release is how much it like goes on after the sustain. So a pluck would look something like this. And then you would have an LFO that also goes saw down, controls the cutoff, make it go one way. So this would basically equate to like turning like a filter from 100 to like, I don't know, like 10 really quick. So, like you need a little resonance to create like this type of sound. But for like house bass, you probably don't need it. And then, yeah, distort it if you want. Obviously, this is very, very simple, but definitely like a lot of how my sounds work is based off of like synth theory, basically. Obviously, you can get like flux sound with like a grand delay, of which you won't need to use like tremolos and filters as much. But I think it's cool to like maybe you can mix like different ideas together. Maybe you can use the filter technique with the grand delay. I've never tried that, so maybe that can create some cool sound.
Do you oftentimes refer to like serum tutorials and try to apply them on the MK2?
I used to do that a lot with the SY, and that's how I learned a lot about serum to start with. But then nowadays, because I basically know how most common sounds are made on serum, I just think about how it would be made on the Mark II. Usually, when it comes to textures, it's like the tricky part is when they use different like waveforms and they modulate the waveform to make it move. Like a dubstep bass, for example, they often like would automate the wavetable position to make it even more like vowel-y, and they would use like comb filters, for example, that we don't have. But then like delays, phasers, those can you pretty close. Like one sound I really wanted to get early on was the like the frog sounds for like drum and bass, like something like that. That's Mark II only, and I figured it like phaser helps a lot, and using filter as well. But yeah, eventually you figure out your own style. For the frog basses that like producers make, a lot of times they use bend, which literally bends the waveform, and it's no way to emulate that on the Mark II. So you have to be creative and find your own ways.
When you say you use delay, is the theory like, you know how phasers like basically creates another sound but delayed, right?
You can think about it that way, yes, but the way I use delays are usually way simpler than that. I just use a low time, something like that, like for a panning delay at the very end, like 30, sometimes 40, 16 if you want. It depends on which note and texture, and then put a little feedback on. I would like low cut it for sure. Sometimes low cut like a lot, and then put like the level higher so that there's actually more high end presence. That's one way to make it stereo for one. So instead of using chorus, maybe sometimes you want to use this, and it creates this metallic effect. And if you turn down the feedback, then it's like basically like stereo enhanced, but like slightly delayed. So sometimes maybe you want this as well. The panning delay is the most natural way to create stereo, I think, without changing the texture of the sound. So I recommend that. Sometimes it's like I use flanger. Separation on flanger is technically make things stereo. I don't know if you've experimented with that. Like with chords, that works really well, in my opinion. Like, did I use that for piggy piggy piggy? I would sequence it with flanger, and then it would move, and then separation makes it stereo. So then I don't need to even put a chorus on.
So you sequence the separation?
I sequence the E level to
the E level, okay.
For like level sequencing.
For flanger, does having a lower depth value versus a higher depth value have an effect on the same separation value? Yeah, the higher the depth, the more the separation value affects the stereo. If I have the depth on 100, it can go like very stereo. Like it would be very uncomfortable for me to talk to you like this. If it's like 20 depth, it really doesn't do as much. It doesn't feel like as much. Honestly, I would think less about specific sounds for now, but like more about workflow for you specifically, because I feel like that's the main game changer. Because if you can figure out your own workflow, I know it's like the word's been tossed around a little too much, but like if you can figure out what's comfortable for you in terms of techniques and in terms of mixing as well, just how you make music in general, then you know where to go from there. And once you lean on that a little more, it becomes a system that will work for battles and everything. And then naturally your music is just going to get better, you know. Then you're not reusing the same system that you've been using, that you've been talking about, like maybe like chords, bass, drums, and then filter, sing, filter up, feature, bass drop, you know. Yeah. Okay, yeah. And
Yeah.
you recommend getting like a FL Studio Ableton for Spectrum?
Definitely, especially catching bigger issues. I used to rely on it like a lot. At some point, you kind of, some people don't need it as much, but it's a tool, so try it out, I'd say.
For the Loopy Pro plugin you were using, like the spectrum analyzing, how much did that cost?
The spectrum analyzer costs nothing. The span is free. This is the plugin. For Loopy Pro, I just used this one. It's one of the most famous plugins like ever, and it's cheaper on the iPad.
If I was gonna get a second device, I was thinking about starting Loopy Pro instead.
That's fair. I feel like you have a lot of fun with Loopy Pro, honestly, because it's really easy, in my opinion, to make good melodic sounds, at least on Loopy Pro, because like a vocal sample to make like pads and chords, like it just naturally sounds good. Like doesn't take a lot of effort.
If I'm gonna start one, would you recommend getting the Loopy Pro, or would you recommend getting like Ableton FL Studio and then
Span?
Span.
I say you should get Span and do like Ableton or FL, whatever. The cost is super low, and it's good to know about this stuff. Like it's also, you should get Vital. This is free, and it's a really good synth. It has everything you would need to learn about synth theory, like how a lot of producers make EDM, and about modulation as well. Like just so that you don't have to pay. So learning about that gives you a good fundamental, like good fundamental knowledge on, as I said, how people make certain sounds. It's a good starting point, I'd say. Yeah.
Okay.
I think with the way looping's going now and how complex ideas can be, especially like I end up making everything on Ableton. I would like record loop sounds, and then I would sequence everything so that I kind of know how my drops are going to be, and then I do all the assigns on the Launchpad. Like that is way faster than me trying to change how the assigns work like 1,000 times. Because and you know how the assigned stuff work on the Launchpad, right?
Yes. You told me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I forget. Yeah. Cool. Have you ever thought of getting a second device that's not Loopy Pro, or like what's the thought process behind wanting to get Loopy Pro?
Like, since like in the current looping, it's basically like you either do MK2 or it's like MK2 only versus everything else, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, even if I get like an 8x FX or something, like it won't give me like a super competitive edge over people using DAWs and whatnot. So I was like, why not? If I am gonna get 8FX and still gonna be kind of limited with what I can do, maybe I should just start Loopy Pro directly, because it's pretty, you can sequence drums. There's so much more you can do than using the MK2. So
yeah, that's true. The thing is, with Loopy Pro, the kind of limiting factor is your CPU, is what I realized. Again, it depends on what type of music you're trying to make. But if you're trying to make something that I've been making with the SY, it would take, because like the SY has 3 instruments, right? And I would sequence it so that different basses come out at different times. And I would sometimes record 3 layers, like 3 instruments, and then, have another 3 for the drop. So that's already 6 instruments. And I would basically need 6 inputs for that on Loopy Pro to do that, at least because then I have to process that 6 different times and have like potentially like 6 distortions or whatnot. Like obviously I want to process the basses differently so that they're different sounds. And I've ended up using like 10 inputs or like over 10 inputs. And then for one, they're not in presets, which means I have to look at the whole thing and manage all that at once. And secondly, my CPU just can't handle it. And then the audio clips, which is unfortunate. Maybe I'm not doing it the smartest way possible, but that's the issue I ran into. But again, like doing melodic stuff, it's great, I think. And especially if you're not thinking about going by the rules, and like if you're not competing, you can just that's what I'm probably gonna do in the future. Like I'm just gonna get a synth plugin, which like I'm just gonna use a synth plugin and use like Sample Wiz, for example, and just have a bunch of sampled sounds in. I can sample loop sounds as well, and then I just play it. I just use those sounds. Then I won't have to process it like on the spot. Like I don't have to make everything just from, I can have more freedom in terms of that. But yeah, point is that if you go the producer route, it can be pretty limitless in terms of like, I find myself like wanting to have more capabilities all the time, no matter what I'm using. So yeah,
I feel the same way using Mark II.
Yeah. What do you think the main thing you would want from the Mark II is?
Kind of want more tracks.
Same.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing for me. I always run out of tracks.
Not enough.
Yeah. I've thought of competing in China Champs with 2 Mark IIs because I have 2 Mark IIs as well. Just like one of them is pretty faulty, but like just imagine like 1 Mark II with all just like drums sequencing, and then with maybe like 2 bass sounds. And then everything else, that'd be pretty cool. A lot of work though, but yeah.
Yeah, with just one MK2, it's kind of hard to make different drum patterns. Yeah, because sequencing the drums like the way Rage did in JVV Wildcard takes up a lot of track space too.
Yeah.
So it's not like the most ideal way, like especially for feature bass, because you have chord on one track and then bass and melody, which is 3.
Yeah.
And if you have drums and snare, then you can't really record anything else, which is not ideal.
Yeah, that's what, like I say, undo redo is the solution usually, and bouncing and replace mode specifically also. But then at some point, honestly, like just like exploring all that, it feels like I'm doing a circus trick at some point. Like that's how I feel about one device, and it's impressive. But it's also, and it's fun for battles. I still enjoy that, but at some point it feels like normal people won't get it either. I mean, I don't even understand how a lot of like Bannon, for example, a lot of his maneuvers, I just kind of, it's impressive because I just don't know what's happening like half of the time for me. It's not like I tried really hard to think about it, but but yeah, that's the beauty of it, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, like drums, for example, you can always just bounce and then use replace mode. Then you have 2 sets of drums.
Yeah.
That's how I prefer to do it, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, but you can't really do that when you want to do undo redo hi-hats. So
that's true.
That's like the issue that I'm facing right now. Yeah.
Yeah. It's tough because also like the way you have no limits is producing. Then you have no limits. Then you can change every beat if you want. Switch to a different song every bar if you want. But that's a whole different game in itself. Yeah.
I guess that's pretty much all for me. I guess just one last thing is I want to try the bass plug thing you showed. Not the bass, the growly plug.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
The effect was LPF synth distortion LPF.
Yeah.
Was it? Am I correct? Okay. And you just do like just drums kick.
For the wild card I did that, but you can like whatever you want, just as long as it's loud enough. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
That's the question. One last question I had. So.
All right. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Hope this helped.
'Cause I don't wanna let you go. Wanna let the flowers flow.